After almost 6 years of war, the Allies have secured victory over Japan. They were years of unspeakable cruelty and enormous sacrifices. Between September 1939 and late 1942, Britain and her allies suffered a series of bitter defeats in Europe and North Africa initially, and then in large parts of the Far East, including Malaya, Burma, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Victory only came after the nation had pulled together under the inspirational leadership of Winston Churchill. Being honest about the hardships that the nation would have to go through, he talked not only of national survival and national interest, but also of the noble causes for which Britain was fighting, including freedom and Christian civilization. His leadership inspired and united our people, giving hope to the nation and to many others around the world. To stand firm required courage, an attribute which Churchill himself called the first of human qualities. And it was his courage and the courage of the many millions of men and women involved at home and abroad that carried us through. Courage like that of a chap called Mike Calvert, known in military circles as Mad Mike Calvert. Back in the early 1950s, when I was just 3 or 4 years old, my father, who was an engineer with Shell, worked in Australia. Mike Calvert was one of his team and became a family friend, teaching me to swim. A Cambridge graduate in engineering and the Army's middleweight boxing champion for a while, Mike had a love of blowing things up and a passion for guerrilla warfare. Leading a company-sized column on the first Chindit operation behind enemy lines in Burma in 1943, he won a DSO. And then, aged just 30, as a brigadier, he commanded 77 Indian Infantry Brigade on many other operations throughout 1944-45. He served under both Wavell and Bill Slim, in my view, the greatest British commander of the war. At the time he worked with my dad, I was too young to understand what Mike had got up to. But some years later, my father chatted to me and told me more, which led me, as a Lieutenant Colonel instructor at the British Army Staff College in Camberley, to ask Mike to come and speak at our Realities of War study. His descriptions of the nature of the operations he'd been involved with in the jungles were pretty harrowing, particularly the hand-to-hand combat. He'd led a bayonet charge against Japanese positions, and he'd once found himself face to face in a river with a Japanese officer. Both were washing themselves and their clothes well away from their patrols, and Mike only survived the ensuing knife fight simply because he'd kept his boots on, unlike the Japanese officer. Or Noel Duckworth, a rather unique priest, canon and first chaplain of Churchill College, Cambridge. Noel went to Jesus College in 1931 and got a rowing blue as Cox in the 1934 boat race, before going on to Ridley and securing a triple blue, along with it the selection as Cox for the GB8 in the Berlin Olympics. From 1939, he was chaplain to the 2nd Battalion, the Cambridgeshire Regiment, part of 53 Brigade. Deploying to the Far East, he was recorded as missing in Malaya after the fall of Singapore. But actually, he'd stayed on behind with the wounded before being captured by the Japanese. Held in Changi, which I visited some years ago, he then worked on the infamous Burma Railway, the railway of death, not just surviving those awful conditions, but ministering to others throughout it all. Referred to as a 20th century saint by a fellow prisoner, his inspirational concern for those suffering, along with his undiminished wit, won the admiration and gratitude of a multitude of soldiers from many parts of the world. Despite being severely beaten and thrown into a pit, surviving on water alone for several days, he continued to show enormous courage. Known as Ducky to everyone, and unlike Mad Mike, Noel was a rather diminutive figure and didn't quite fit the dashing war hero template that we often imagine. but erecting a jungle church and forming a choir who sang to the men too frail to move, he would finish his services with rousing bouts of Australia, land of hope and glory, and finally, God save the King. And as he left, he would roar, to hell with the nips. Victory in 1945 was, of course, hugely important. But although we live in a very different world today, it is nonetheless a world where evil still prowls like a roaring lion, and courageous men and women are called upon to stand firm. Like the prominent Chinese human rights lawyer, Gao Shisheng, whose Christian beliefs motivate him to defend underground churches against the secret police, saying to one, "I can't guarantee that you will win the lawsuit. In fact, you'll almost certainly lose. But I warn you that if you are too timid to confront their barbaric behavior, you will be completely defeated." Tortured and imprisoned, his courage in the face of barbarism is the same as Mike's and Noel's was all those years ago. Courage is about going forward because we know in our hearts that we cannot go back without destroying what we hold to be true. It means carrying on to the end despite the opposition, even when others fall away or undermine the cause. It means trusting that justice and righteousness will ultimately prevail. But such courage isn't found easily. In the closing lines of his Christmas message in 1939, just as the dark clouds of war were forming, King George VI, referring to our Christian civilization, quoted words taken from a poem popularly known as The Gate of the Year by Minnie Louise Haskins. "I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, 'Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown.' And he replied, 'Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way.'" It was a powerful message then, and I think it's a good message for us today, especially as we deal with the fallout from the darkness of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has drawn on the reserves of courage in so many. Although many would live with the consequences of the war for the rest of their lives, particularly those who'd fought in the Far East, after 6 years, VJ Day was greeted by many with a huge sense of relief. Their darkness had finally lifted, and it is right that we remember it today. Amen.